And welcome back, students. Let's jump right into our next lesson. Today we're going to be discussing operating systems. So let's just first start off by defining what is an operating system. Well, operating system is system software that manages computer hardware and software resources and provides common services for computer applications. Now we will focus on 4 primary desktop operating systems as well as 2 primary mobile operating systems. So let's start off Microsoft Windows. Microsoft Windows, of course, is a group of several graphical operating system families, all which are developed, marketed, and sold by Microsoft. Now, there, of course, are many different iterations of Microsoft Windows. Now, support does not exist for operating systems for Windows Vista or older as of the time of recording. And just to note, Windows 7 support will end in January 14, 2020, and Windows 8 support, which includes also 8.1, will end in January 10th, 2023. All right, so let's start talking about some of those iterations. Let's first start off with Windows 1.0. And this is kind of a screenshot of the interface. But when Windows first came out, if you recall, it was on IBM DOS-based machines. And that's probably the reason why IBM machines eventually became very popular, is because of the Windows operating system. Now, there's several versions of DOS-based Windows. Windows 1.1, or 1.0, 2.0, 2.1x, 3.0, and 3.x. Now, the X, of course, is not meaning that it actually says 3.1x. It would actually say something like 3.11, 3.12, etc. It's that X just represents the serialized version of whatever that update was. Now, this, of course, is a screenshot of Windows 1.0. It was released in 1985 and was supported by Microsoft for a whopping 16 years, which is pretty long by Windows Standard Time, because usually Windows supports their stuff for about 10. Here's Windows 2.0. It came out in 1987. It allowed for overlapping windows, unlike Windows 1.0. So if I just quickly take us back, other than this initial pop-up here for the Microsoft Windows logo here, you'll see that everything else here is taking up a space. It's all divided kind of to almost like a grid. Whereas like here, you can see like, for example, these apps are not docked to anything. You can see, for example, the clock app is overlapping the control panel. There's also substantial growth in third-party applications, which means these are apps that were not developed by Microsoft. All right, then there was the incremental Windows 2.1. All right, it came out in 1988. Now, what's important about Windows 2.1 is that it was the first version of Windows requiring a hard drive for installation. Prior to this, you didn't need a hard drive. You just loaded the operating system off and went. Next was Windows 3.0, and that came out in 1990. Now, this is the first widely successful version of Windows. So when Windows 3.0 came out, pretty much that's when computers really were able to kind of start taking off in terms of Windows machines. Part of the reason for this was it had a redesigned user interface, and it also had better memory management. So you're already now starting to see Windows become more mainstream. And then 3.1 followed that, which was in 1992. It was known as the first desktop publisher because it had the ability to make desktop publishing. And what was most unique about 3.1 is that it was the first version to have backwards compatibility with previous versions of Windows. So, for example, prior to 3.1, if you had an app that was made for Windows 2.1 and you tried to run in Windows 3.0, it wouldn't work because it was a different version of Windows. When Windows 3.1 came along, what they did is they added in backwards compatibility, which would allow you to use those older apps in your machine. All right, then you have Windows 95, and you can see Windows 95 looks vastly different from its predecessors. And of course, it came out in, surprise, surprise, in 1995. There was many significant improvements in the GUI and the graphical user interface, and it introduced the Start menu, plug-and-play features, and changed from 16-bit to 32-bit architecture, which is very significant. Going from 16 to 32 allowed for a lot more resources for things such as memory, program applications, and stuff like that. Plug-and-play features means that pretty much if you take a piece of hardware and you plug it in, it's going to try to automatically install the driver for that piece of hardware. That's the easiest way to kind of explain that. Then we move to Windows 98, and you can see it looks very similar to that of Windows 95. Right? It was the successor, of course, and it included numerous improvements in things like support for USB, which we use very widely today, networking TCP/IP protocols, because the internet was becoming a pretty big thing at this point in time, and so they had to start standardizing the networks, and so TCP/IP became the standard, and so Windows 98 was the version that incorporated that standard. And of course, you have performance improvements because Windows 98 performed a lot better than Windows 95. There's also a second edition of Windows 98 that was released in 1999 that featured some minor bug fixes, and it also supports for hardware including audio and modems. Again, modems because it relating to the internet, and audio because at this point now people are starting to use their computers for recreational things. So you're going to start having things like sound on your computer. All right, then came Windows Millennium Edition. All right, you can see it's still kind of similar to the previous versions, but there are some slight changes. It came out in 2000 as a successor to Windows 98. Now, while it was aimed at the consumer, the product had a relatively short shelf life. And the reason for this is that it was considered to be buggy, slow, unstable, and rushed. Therefore, the product really did not sell well with customers. And because of this, Microsoft kind of hurried along and released Windows XP, which quickly replaced Windows ME. This is Windows XP, a very favorite operating system for a lot of people. It came out in 2001 as the Windows Experience. Windows XP actually is short for Experience, and was a vast improvement over its predecessors. Another big thing is you switched to using the NT kernel instead of the 9X kernel, which allowed for a lot more capabilities. And that operating system, in turn, would prove to be the second most popular Windows operating system. It was also one of the first versions of Windows to use product activation to combat piracy. Prior to this, you didn't necessarily have that, but now in order to activate Windows, you had to input a serial key, otherwise you'd get a message that says Windows is not activated. There's also a redesigned interface. As you can see, there are some significant changes between this and like ME and 98 and 95. And it implemented 7 new features such as Windows Firewall. Windows Firewall, of course, is a software piece that helps monitor and allow and disallow traffic through your internet ports. Now, the operating system would eventually release 3 major bug and security fixes in the form of security packs. All right, next up is Windows Vista. This came out in 2006, and it came more than 5 years after XP. It featured a new user interface and a visual style known as Arrow. It also included new tools such as Windows Search and Windows DVD Maker. Now, in order to counter the criticism of previous version of Windows and the vulnerability to viruses and malware, Vista would use a feature called User Account Control, or UAC. However, this, along with high system requirements, restrictive licensing, and lack of backwards compatibility, saw lower satisfaction and adoption rates of this stuff. UAC was probably one of the biggest things because things that people could do in XP, now they couldn't necessarily do without having UAC elevated permissions. The restrictive licensing is there's a lot more terms for how things can be used, and backwards compatibility. When Vista first came out, if you had something that was designed for, let's say, Windows 98, you may not have found support for it, simply because Vista was trying to move everything forward. But at the same time, Microsoft forgot there's still a lot of people using older systems. So there's that to be said. Then we moved to Windows 7, which was one of the more popular ones here. It came out in 2009, which is an incremental upgrade from the requirements for Vista. It featured a new feature, which was dubbed the Super Bar, a redesigned taskbar, which allowed for pinning and previewing of an open applications window. If you don't know what that means if you have an app along your taskbar, you can, when it's open, you can right-click on the icon on your taskbar, and there's an option to pin it. And what that does is permanently effectively creates a shortcut right there on your taskbar. And then, of course, previewing it is if you just hover over it, it generates a small thumbnail of what's on that screen. Of course, now Windows 7 has a pretty positive reception. Of course, then we move from positive to that of Windows 8. So this came out in 2012, a couple years after 7. It was developed for wide use devices such as personal computers, laptops, and tablets. Now, because they're trying to primarily target the tablet market, it had major design changes to the user interface in order to improve the user experience there. They also moved the start screen from a start menu into a grid of dynamically updated tiles, kind of as you can see here. Now, because there's such a radical change and departure, Windows 8 was really kind of criticized for the removal of the start button. Like, there's no start button that you could just click on to open up your stuff. Everything was done here through the screen. Now, Windows 8.1 was released in October 2013 in order to address many of the criticisms addressed by early adopters. 8.1 improved many improvements such as a tile size adjustment, so they weren't automatically generated, a start button of sorts, so you could still kind of have that old start button that you could use, and other various fixes such as bug and security ones. Then we get to our modern operating system, which is that Windows 10. All right, it's the current version of Windows as the recording and is the first version of Windows to receive ongoing updates. Windows 10 is now the most installed version of Windows and has received mostly positive reviews. And when I say mostly positive, there is some concerns about things such as data collection and privacy that is ongoing with the OS. But that's enough about Windows. Let's switch to our next major operating system, which is that of Mac. All right, and we're going to kind of speed through Mac a little bit because the first versions of Mac System 1 and 5 are not really that much to kind of show and talk about. All right, the early versions of Mac used what was known as the classic Mac OS. There was first System 1, which is the first Mac operating system. It would introduce the graphical user interface, which eliminated the command line interface that was used in Windows. This is prior to Windows 1.0, because remember, Windows started off with DOS. Pretty much when computers first came out, everything was done through the command line. If you wanted to do something, you had to type it in the command line. When System 1 came out, they really kind of changed things because, well, now you just navigated. You had a mouse, you clicked on stuff. You want to open something, you could just open it. System 2 would then introduce AppleTalk, which was an early networking protocol. This is before TCP/IP was standardized. System 3 and 4 would introduce several new hardware features, including larger displays, because at this point in time, a lot of computer software manufacturers were also doing hardware stuff. That would eventually change for like Windows. They would just specialize in software, but Apple has always tried to do their own thing. System 5 would eventually add Multi-Finder, which is an extension that allowed the user to run several applications at the same time. As part of that, you could kind of run like one app at a time. You could have things open, but you weren't really going to be doing high efficiency because there wasn't like multi-core CPUs. You didn't have hyper-threaded CPUs. None of that stuff existed at this time. All right, then let's move to System 6, which came out in 1988. It features something known as Macro Maker, which was a feature that allowed the user to create keyboard and mouse recordings known as macros. Which is a macro, if you're not familiar with it, pretty much is you record a bunch of keystrokes and then you can run the macro and it'll do them. So, for example, if you wanted to have a macro that will automatically type, like let's say you're doing a thing for business, you can have it type out like your name, your job title, your contact information. You can write a macro that will automatically generate that. There's also numerous improvements for things such as multitasking, using multiple apps at once, and hardware support. Now let's move to Mac OS 7. Right, it came out in 1991, and it would remain the main Mac operating system all the way up to 1998, so it actually had a good fair run. It had features such as virtual memory, file sharing, QuickTime, QuickDraw 3D, and improved UI. Let's go ahead and jump right to Mac OS 8. Alright, which came out in 1997. Now, it put a vast overhaul of the Mac OS, a large emphasis on color. You can see like the screenshot right here is a lot more colorful than the previous ones that we've been looking at. Now, despite coming at a difficult time in Apple history, piracy groups actually kind of encouraged people to buy the operating system because if Apple had gone out of business at this time, pretty much the only option would have been Windows. So they wanted to maintain that competitive edge out there. Next up is Mac OS 9, which was the last major release of the quote-unquote classic Mac OS. Right, this came out in 1999 and it was branded as having 50 new features. That was their big selling point, was 50 new features. However, support for development was soon dropped in favor of developing Mac OS 10, so pretty much Mac OS 9 didn't really have a very long shelf life. In fact, in 2002, Steve Jobs gave a keynote address by staging a mock funeral for Mac OS 9. So here's Mac OS 10. which is designed to run exclusively on Mac computers and has been preloaded on all Macs since 2002. It actually came out though in 2001, and the operating system has released periodic updates named after big cats all the way up to version 10.8. Then 10.8, I think it was when they decided to call Mavericks. And it kind of broke with the cat naming convention. Now, Mac OS X was originally designed to run on Power PCs until Mac decided to switch over to Intel, and that began in 2006. So now that's why they're a little more expensive too, because they're using Intel-based chips. Now, the aqua theme that's prevalent in Macs uses soft edges, translucent colors, and pinstripes to bring color and textures to the interface. So whenever you look at Mac, and everybody looks at Mac, you kind of recognize, oh yeah, this is the Mac interface. That interface that you're so used to seeing, the theme of it is aqua. All right, that's enough on Macs. Let's move to the next one, which is Linux. Now, I'm not going to go too much into Linux because there's a lot that you can really go off on with Linux because there's so many different variations of it. So let's just kind of briefly talk about it. Linux was developed in 1991 as a free operating system for Intel 86X computers. Now, Linux has become the leading operating system on servers and mainframe computers. Now, Linux is unique in that the source code is open source, meaning that it can be modified, used, and distributed by anyone either for profit or not. Now, Linux has been modified and adapted in numerous other operating systems as well. Some popular favorites include things like Ubuntu or even Debian. One of the things is because Linux is such a big thing and there's so many different flavors that exist, it's actually technically, if you just count all the different flavors, it's the most popular operating system out there. All right, now let's take a look quickly at Chrome OS because an example of Linux adaptation is that of the Chrome operating system. Google did this in 2011 and released the Chrome OS. It was based really on a kind of what's known as a minimalistic approach. So the user interface largely just consisted of the Chrome web browser. I mean, there's been some changes and stuff since then, but when it first came out, there was only 3 applications. You had the browser, a file manager, and a media player. However, over time, Chrome has allowed for additional Chrome and even some Android apps to be able to run on the Chrome operating system. And you can see here, like in the screenshot, for example, you can pin different things here, and you can open the apps. A lot of these still will run through your web browser, but you can now add other apps. Now, typically, all your files are going to be stored in the cloud and not locally on the computer. I mean, yes, you can still download stuff onto the computer. That's how you can necessarily play it off the media manager. But a lot of that stuff is still cloud-based. All right, let's get into the mobile operating systems. Let's first talk about iOS. It's a mobile operating system designed exclusively to run on Apple hardware. Now, it has the second largest market share behind Android, and its App Store contains more than 2.2 billion apps with over 130 billion downloads. Right? iOS is originally designed as a way for Apple to kind of really take their Mac operating system and kind of shrink it down, make it work for mobile devices, because they had like the iPod Touch, they had the iPad, iPhone, so it's really supposed to function across all those systems. And of course, then we have Android. It's a mobile operating system developed by Google. It's based on a modified version of the Linux kernel and other open source software. So again, here's Linux, hard at work. Now, interesting thing about Android is that it was actually originally developed by Android Inc., which is part of how it has its name, before being bought by Google and really being implemented full force into as a smartphone platform. And if you didn't catch on the previous slide, Android is the best-selling operating system. However, a note about this is that unlike iOS, it can be modified by manufacturers using the associated development platform, which is why, like if you have a Samsung operating system, it's slightly different from that of a LG operating system. Or if you have, any other of the manufacturers, you'll see that how things are presented in one phone are different from how they might be presented in another phone. All right, and that's going to kind of wrap us up for today, folks. So until next time.